grandfather used to serve in the police force, and over the years he accumulated a wealth of fascinating and mysterious detective stories. He loved sharing them with us, and some of them were so bizarre that even seasoned investigators couldn't explain them. Here's one of those stories. The first case I want to tell you about happened back in '93. What makes it so intriguing is that no one could ever explain what actually took place. My granddad even showed me a couple of photos from the crime scene, one of the apartment building where it happened, and another of the stairwell where the body was found. For those who love details, it was the second entrance, between the third and fourth floors. It was a cold, damp night, the kind that makes the street lights flicker as if hesitating to stay on. A slight mist curled around the edges of the buildings, muffling distant sounds and making the whole neighborhood feel eerily quiet. The clock had just struck 10 p.m. when the investigative team was called to the scene. In a small town, that usually meant whoever was available at the time, but at least a detective and a forensic expert were always present. As they stepped into the dimly lit stairwell, the scent of iron filled their nostrils, a sickly metallic tang that only meant one thing: blood. And there was a lot of it. The officers' boots made a sticky sound as they walked, the crimson pooling beneath them in a grotesque reflection of the overhead fluorescent light. And then they saw it. The body lay sprawled on the landing, as if the man had been dropped there like a discarded rag doll. His head, however, was not where it should have been. Instead, it lay just a foot away, severed clean off. The edges of the wound were jagged, like it had been chewed off, as my granddad put it. The victim's face was frozen in a final grimace, his eyes glassy, staring into nothingness. The man had been dressed for nothing more than a casual step outside. Sweatpants, a sweater, slippers. His clothing was shredded in multiple places, deep gashes visible beneath the fabric. The forensic expert confirmed immediately that the body was fresh. Rigor mortis hadn't set in yet, meaning the death had occurred less than 2 hours prior. That was later corroborated when they questioned the man's grieving widow. She lived on the 4th floor, just 10 feet up the stairs from where the body lay. She was also the one who found him. Now, the widow was a heavy drinker and was already wasted when they spoke to her, but they still managed to get some basic information. Her husband had gone out to take the trash around 9:30 p.m. After about 15 minutes, she started to worry. Figured maybe he'd stopped by his drinking buddies, who liked to hang out on the bench outside and knock back something strong. Her apartment windows didn't face the courtyard, so she couldn't check. She decided to go after him, but as soon as she stepped out and took a few steps down the stairs, she saw his mutilated body in a pool of blood. She never gave any more useful information, no matter how many times they questioned her. Now, for the weird part, interviews with the building's residents turned up absolutely nothing. Not one person heard screams, a struggle, or even a single loud noise. And keep in mind, back then, apartment doors were basically plywood with no soundproofing whatsoever. That night, a few guys were actually sitting on the bench drinking. They said they had been there since 8 p.m. According to them, only 2 people had entered the building in that time. An elderly woman from the 1st floor and a single mother from the 2nd floor. Neither of them saw or heard anything either, and no one had exited the building. The stairwell itself was narrow and slightly claustrophobic, with yellowed walls and flickering overhead lights that buzzed faintly in the silence. The detectives scanned for any signs of forced entry, any trails of blood leading away from the crime scene. Nothing. Just that horrific, brutalized body, sitting in a pool of its own lifeblood, the smell of copper thick in the stagnant air, At first, my granddad suspected a dog attack. What else could have done that kind of damage in the stairwell of a city building? Turns out, 2 people in the building owned dogs, but both were small breeds, definitely incapable of inflicting wounds like that. The autopsy confirmed it. The victim's head had been completely severed as if by the jaws of a massive animal. His spine had been crushed where it was bitten through. One of the bites on his leg was especially strange. It left a perfect impression of upper and lower teeth, as if deliberately made for show. The forensic expert said he had never seen anything like it. And here's the kicker. The bite mark resembled that of a dog, but from a much larger animal. Even stranger, it had 48 teeth. A normal dog at most has 42, often fewer and rarely more than that. The more they examined the body, the more unsettling the details became. The wounds were inconsistent with a frenzied animal attack. There were no defensive wounds, no signs of a struggle. It was almost as if the victim had been completely paralyzed before he was mauled. And yet, there was no sign of sedatives, no indication that he had been unconscious beforehand. It made no sense. Another strange thing. There was only blood right around the body, none on the stairs leading up or down, almost like the man had been placed there first, and then, in complete silence, something had chewed off his head. For reference, my dog once killed an aggressive stray boxer, and there was blood everywhere. It was dripping from his mouth and chest the whole way home. A human has way more blood than a dog, and yet, in this case, everything was clean. The detectives stood there for a long time, the stale stairwell air pressing in on them. The silence felt heavier now, charged with an unease none of them could shake. What could have done this? More importantly, where did it go? So, what do we have? Something big appearing out of nowhere on a stairwell, silently biting off a grown man's head, leaving a few extra wounds, and then vanishing without a trace. And how was the case closed, officially? Stray dog attack. They even scolded some local guys responsible for catching stray dogs, telling them to do a better job. And that was that. But my granddad never forgot, and neither will I.